Hi, today I want to talk about the very important threat of ignorance. And I mean that to someone like me, um, ignorance and failure to understand inherent differences and thus demean it um, becomes a very real existential threat. When I go to visit my mother and my stepmother in Florida, uh, when I get agitated or angry and say I flip someone the bird, happens. Don't feel particularly proud at those moments, but it happens. They get scared because of stand your ground laws and gun control laws. See, when I'm overwhelmed and I lose my temper, it looks something very scary. Um, but the nature of that is overstimulation. The nature of that is my own fear, my own concerns. And yet, because we can't seem to have this conversation on difference, and we can't seem to take the time to really understand what is actually threatening and not threatening, um, there's a lot of places where if somebody feels scared because I'm having a meltdown, especially as an adult male, right? I should have it together. I should be okay, but I'm not. I'm not neurotypical. I'm autism spectrum. Um, but somebody's fear, based in ignorance of these behaviors, therefore becomes justifiable reason to use lethal force against me. Um, I'm not going to get specifics, but there are plenty of studies right now that indicate that stand your ground laws affect disproportionately minorities, of course. That's the big one all the time. I mean, at least I have an advantage. When I have a meltdown, I'm a white male. Heaven forbid I was a black male. I would really, really be in trouble. Black, autistic, verbal, not a good combination. Um, and that's ridiculous. Um, and so I have to live in fear of being overwhelmed by stimuli, and yet we live in a world that is bombarded with sensory stimuli, bombarded with data. When you step outside your door, there's no escaping it, especially if you're in a reasonably urban setting. I mean, hell, I mean, I don't, I don't know how hypersensory kids manage living in a big city. I don't. I couldn't do it anymore. I love the city. I love visiting the city. But it needs to be in short bursts. It needs to be places where I can retreat to and feel safe and have sort of a fortress of solitude. Um, and so ignorance and a failure to understand difference, a failure to understand that even adults who suffer from overstimulation factors or mental illness or PTSD or homelessness, a host of things, are disproportionately affected by stand your ground laws. Um, and so I think it's important, and you know, I'm not actually anti-gun. I do lean towards the libertarian side of things, but I think part of having personal liberty and freedom is also a requirement to be knowledgeable on certain things, and that moments of snap decisions based on not just fear, but fear grounded in ignorance, a lack of knowledge. And I'm not saying you're an ignorant bastard. I'm not saying that as a mean to demean you. We are all ignorant of certain things. No one person can take in all knowledge, all data, and object reality. It's just an unrealistic expectation. It's impossible. There's too much data out there. But there are some big things, some important things. And it is important that we take a moment, instead of demeaning, to normalize certain behaviors that we see as crazy or insane. I'm sorry if you think a grown adult should never have a meltdown, but my brain's not wired that way. And especially with complex PTS and hypervigilance, hypervigilance overinflates probability. And it forces me to be grounded and utilize my senses constantly to look for and be aware of potential threats. The sad fact of that is it makes me more prone to meltdowns. It makes me more prone to being overwhelmed because I don't feel safe. And knowing that if I become overwrought and I start just going off on the mouth at a verbal tirade, if someone is scared and feels threatened by this, they can place a bullet in my head. That's some scary shit, guys. Because for the most part, I'm a nice, compassionate, friendly, even social sort of guy. I mean, I will stop to someone in the grocery store and I can easily start up a 15-minute conversation with them. I'm also curious about people. I'm interested in people. And yet, a lot of times I'm afraid to go out and interact with people because if there is a trigger event, that I will be judged, demeaned, or possibly even shot. There's something really wrong with that picture. Now, part of responsible gun ownership then, and I think the NRA could actually assist with this, if they would take a little bit of their funding and money and not only address issues of mental illness in the population, also join hands with folks in the autism community to help deobfuscate, to help illuminate and show that certain behaviors that many people assume are threatening, if they don't take a certain turn, aren't. And I'm not saying that if somebody doesn't taunt me or threaten me that I can't physically react against them. But that's only going to occur when somebody actually begins to threaten me. Otherwise, if you're a non-threat, I'm just trying to get you the hell away from me. I'm trying to force people back. I'm trying to keep people away. In many ways, bizarre as it is, I'm really beating myself up and trying to protect the people around me. And I'm just trying to find the time and space to collect my wits. I don't deserve to have to live in fear of being shot because of neurological inherent difference. It's terrible, guys. You know, a lot of people say a armed society is a polite society. Maybe, but that's because of fear. You don't want a society that lives in fear. You want a society that's polite because we're not demeaning difference, that we're okay with the fact that people don't approach the world the same way. We can be okay with not always agreeing on things, you know. Some people think constant change is a wonderful and glorious things, and some people like me, change can be scary and bad. Now, I love novelty. I do. But that's different than change. And I'm a pretty smart guy. I you know, a pattern thinker. I'm really good at predicting outcomes in social scenarios. You know, I've got more than a few times where I'm a friend where I can say, look, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, because I see it unfolding before me. Patterns. I'm good with that. There's value in that worldview. There's also value in the people who can just see something and react. I very much consider myself not a leader. I'd be ideally an advisor. I'm somebody who sees a lot of possibilities. I use logical triangulation because this is important so you don't get stuck in loops and just jump to conclusions yourself. That's how you end up with conspiracy theory and a whole bunch of other stuff. So you have to train yourself to try to ensure to the best of your ability that your logic is good. But for example, I'm really good with metaphor and jokes and not taking things literally unless I'm tired or I'm stressed. And then my brain, that is a cattail, then my brain becomes very literal at those points in time. It's when I'm exhausted, it goes down to this sort of baseline level of functioning. But for all this difference and for all my issues, we need to talk less about the existence and ownership of guns, and more about the underlying symptoms and issues in society that make people feel compelled to use them on each other. A lot of crime in the world. And over 2,000 years ago, Taoist thought, Lao Tzu said, you create more laws, you create more brigands. You see, the more rigid a social structure becomes, the more intolerant of difference. And as a matter of fact, many people on autism spectrum are broken and berated and beaten because we don't fit that mold. The less we can thrive within it. And thus you start creating subcultures and sub-economies and a host of different fundamental survival mechanisms. And that's really what this is about, survival. And the fact of the matter, in this day and age, that so many people have to fear for their basic survival is ridiculous. It is within our technological powers to address these things. You know, we tend to think of market forces and a lot of these things in society as very natural forces, but they're not. They're human constructs. They're social constructs. And that means we can influence these things. And a big step to doing that is addressing mental health. And you can address part of the issues of mental health by helping understand and normalize certain behaviors that actually aren't mentally ill at all. They're actually a completely different thing. Now, it can be hard on spectrum. It's really easy for mental illness to creep in on spectrum because it's really easy for us to not feel valued, to not feel safe, to not feel secure, especially when we don't thrive working in traditional places and in traditional jobs. You know, when you're going through just corporate application processes and stuff, there's a lot of credentialing that people look at. And, you know, we can go through and get these credentials, but we can't always sell ourselves the same way. It's very formulaic onto how to set up a resume and how to go and do an interview. And we're not formulaic people in that way. We've got our own approaches and differences. So there are a whole lot of reasons, based primarily in ignorance and lack of knowledge, that we get separated out and we don't thrive and we don't succeed. I mean, I can't sit there and work a 9-to-5 job with only 2 breaks. I'm overwhelmed. I'm extremely introverted. I'm also kinetic. I do my best thinking when I get up and move around and pace. Gets the blood flowing. You're never going to get the best work out of someone like me, and not even necessarily a spectrum person, just say a good introverted kinetic learner, if they're chained down. And from a capitalist standpoint, that's actually dumb, guys. Why would you not try to include difference and best utilize difference in different assets? So we need to have a conversation on this. And autism and gun control and responsible gun ownership and normalizing behaviors that people may find odd and not understand, but they should not inherently find threatening to themselves. And the problem is there is some truth to some of this fear. There's a reason why a lot of folks on autism spectrum will go back to a school and be violent. Because it's often the schools and the one-size-fits-alls and the labeling and demeaning that breaks us, that damages us, that turns our world into a living hell. And when people like me break bad, the damage we can do is extensive. It is a concern. When mental illness hijacks autism spectrum, you have the potential for monstrous acts. But when autism spectrum is nurtured and understood, even if we're overwhelmed and have meltdowns, I'm not crazy, I'm not a bad person, I am sorry for the shit that comes out of my mouth. I really am. And I always try to apologize for it. I feel horrible after. And I'm working on these things, but in many ways they're outside of my control. I think we need to have a conversation. I think that no person should have to fear for their existential existence because of difference.